hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones. They are creatures of tropical seas, sweeping up heat-laden water, converting it to wind, rain, and waves. Why do a rare few evolve into colossal monsters that leave in their wake a trail of destruction, death, and despair? Do we now face a rising tide of super hurricanes and typhoons?
Hi, my name is Adam. Living in Florida entitles you to a front row seat during hurricane season. In 2017, 3 major Category 5 hurricanes tore through this state. Fierce winds, torrential rain, vicious tornadoes and flooding. No one knows why hurricanes twist and turn the way they do, and despite excellent tracking and updates, they have an evil history of defying all the models just before landfall. Now, the TV weather desk will blame atmospheric conditions, but that's scant consolation for people living in its projected paths, every day becoming more and more anxious as the monster approaches. The focus shifts to the eye of the storm as it barrels forward, and then we're inundated with vivid graphics on our TV screens depicting an aerial view of nature's wrath. So we got the hurricane eye, and we accept that every hurricane that threatens us usually has one. But if these creatures, if I may call them that, have an eye, do they also have a mind? This was the path of Hurricane Ivan as it roared through Florida in September 2004. If you follow the blue line, you will have seen that having made an initial landfall a little to the west of us here, it then swerved back, got back down to the Keys, Miami area, lassoed, or probably in better English, encircled a significant part of the Bermuda Triangle, and then roared back up to make landfall a little further west, but this time armed with 120 F2 force tornadoes, more tornadoes than have ever been recorded, each one wreaking chaos and mayhem in its path. Take a look at some of the damage that Ivan did in this area alone. Quite an eyeful, isn't it? Most of these photos are from the Fort Walton, Destin area, but who got the brunt of it, admittedly. But we're talking the hurricane in these photographs, so we're showing you the hurricane in these photographs. The tornadoes themselves were obviously shorter lived, but far more vicious and aggressive in their targeted impacts, which, unlike the hurricane, were totally unpredictable. We didn't know when we were going to get them. The one that hit this area formed in the lagoon as a water spout and just trundled up to make landfall near Captain Anderson's, and it tore into quite a few businesses, killed an old man, unfortunately, and did a lot of damage. I decided to ride out Ivan, much against the wishes of a few well-meaning friends. But on the afternoon of the 15th, around 4 o'clock, things got really dark, and I watched with trepidation from the first floor of my house as a funnel-shaped monster appeared from behind the trees and raced across the open space of the Signal Hill golf course facing me. Tore through the buildings of the fun park, and flying debris was shattered across from Beach Road as it raced towards me, and fortunately missing my place by a fraction and plowing into the empty parking lot. As it drove its fury inland, I heaved a huge sigh of relief, but did not know the damage and the havoc that it had caused as it came up through the lagoon. It took a huge swipe at Captain Anderson's, then laid into Hamilton's restaurant, that is, with the force of a dozen wrecking balls. Unfortunately, as I said, an older man had died further up Thomas Drive. I think the roof caved in on his daughter's real estate business, and that was very sad. But when I toured the devastation the following morning, I couldn't believe my eyes. I found a gaping hole in the roof of my friend's house, very much as if some giant bird had just clawed out a specific section and then flown off, leaving the rest of the roof intact, and in all probability next door neighbour was probably untouched or virtually untouched. But Hamilton's had taken a direct hit. It was completely destroyed, almost as if the demolition crew had already been there. And I thought, well, there's another Panama City Beach landmark gone to waste. No doubt we'll be seeing high-rise condos built in the vacant space when they've cleared it out. But in the event, the very existence of that restaurant named Hamilton's had predestined the future of the land on which it had stood. It may have been classified by the insurance companies as an act of God, but it actually turned out to be an act of Santeria.
For millennia, we saw the oceans as mysterious wellsprings of nature's power. Capable of rising up and engulfing us. In William Shakespeare's drama, The Tempest, a ship's crew faces a sudden maelstrom, as dramatized in the 2010 Julie Taymor film. Unknown to the crew, the storm was conjured by a would-be ruler turned sorcerer.
Hell's empty and all the devil's here!
The story is said to have been inspired by a storm that sent the English flagship Sea Venture onto Bermuda shoals in the year 1609. It's now one of many shipwrecks that litter tropical sea bottoms.
Before you dismiss what you've just seen as a typical Hollywood fantasy movie, I think you should check out The Tempest, as written by William Shakespeare himself. The movie was remarkably faithful, or at least in that part where it showed the shipwreck of the Sea Venture, remarkably faithful to the written play, And I think you've also got to remember that back in Elizabethan times, Shakespeare was their version of the internet, Facebook, if you like. People didn't know anything about what was happening abroad, where the British Navy would venture and seize colonies and all kinds of skullduggery went on, until the ships came back to merry old England, and they gave their version of the news, which was obviously elaborated and glorified somewhat, but the story was true. The island was discovered, if you like, or found by Sir George Somers in 1609. At this point, I think you've got to remember that legend has also had a little twist here and a little bit of varnishing there. But it's true that it was discovered by Sir George Somers, an Englishman, who was the first to use the lodestone, which of course is essential to magnify the compass. His ship, the Sea Venture, got shipwrecked, and obviously he'd been trying it out, and it wasn't a very good trial run for the compass. But anyway, they found this island, and they got off the wrecked boat and got to the island, where he met a group of Taino Indians who had been exiled there from Cuba, together with their leader, a priestess, a Santeria priestess by the name of Ranisi. At that time, Ranisi was reputed to have been 150 years old at least, with the body and the face of a beautiful young woman. But she had been a thorn in the side of the Spanish, who'd been bringing slaves to Cuba long before slavery ever was thought in America. And she had these powers, which would, despite their protestations, use to frustrate them. And she was exiled across Havana Bay to a little village named Regla. And Regla de Ocha is actually the Spanish name for Santeria, as I found out, having gone there as a innocent, I can't say tourist because I was there on professional research, but I went to Cuba, I discovered Regla, and I had a most memorable experience that is probably the beginning of the reason I'm telling you this story. So there she was, exiled across Havana Bay, but still she continued her skullduggery. She would cause ships to be sunk. Gold bullion would disappear from the vaults, and the churches, the Spanish churches, would find their doors nailed shut. So in exasperation, they exiled her and her followers to the island now known as Bermuda, about the same time as the Sea Venture was shipwrecked there. She met Somers, and immediately they fell in love. George Somers developed the island, as of course they were marooned there, they couldn't just, get on the phone and say, come and pick me up. They established St. George as the capital, and together they bore 3 children, all girls. He strived to sustain Virginia in later times as an English colony because of repeated attacks by the Indians had threatened to completely wipe it out. And on one such mission he died, or he suffered a fatal injury, and he returned to Bermuda to issue his last words to Ranisi, that she remain in St. George and govern the townspeople, who essentially were the shipwreck crew, and to support them and prosper. Now, his nephew, Matthew, was also with the group, and as things had developed then, they had their own shipbuilding and they were much more settled. He had a ship commissioned to return the body of George Somers to England, where he had been a very prominent, well thought of, respected man. He was actually Lord Mayor of Lyme Regis. So he was sent back to, I think it's Wiltshire, is it, to be buried. But before he went, Renisi, his loving wife, insisted that his heart and his entrails were removed and given to her before they sailed. And legends say she kept them in a wooden box close to the home that they had built together. Renisi remained, was a good leader, and prospered in St. George until the governor of a new British colony named, of all places, West Florida, appeared on the scene. His name was Commodore George Johnson, and he sought to move the capital to the town of Hamilton, some distance away, where he had acquired substantial land investments. Of course, he was still governor of West Florida because that was his commission from the Royal Navy, but this is what he did on the side. He was accruing great swathes of land, hoping to make significant profit. But Renisi and the townspeople vigorously protested because, of course, their livelihoods were at stake and they would be losing that and their future. But these protests were quelled by Johnson's militia, and Renisi was actually violated and left for dead on the threshold of her home. However, the next day she appeared to have recovered, made her way to the town hall steps, flung the heavy wooden doors open where Johnson was making the final arrangements, and brandished the shriveled heart of George Somers in one hand and the compass lodestone which he had given her as a wedding gift in the other. She screamed out the curse that would remain on the Johnsons, all his kinsmen, and anything or anyone who bore the name Hamilton in the colony of West Florida. Throwing the lodestone to the ground, she spat at the governor and vowed that all vessels, all his vessels presumably, but maybe all vessels, would never benefit from the use of a compass and would always disappear from the seas if they ever crossed the routes used by a husband. Renisi then fell dead, and it was said, I don't know by who, but it was said, take my word for it, that her body burned on that spot and remained as a deep, scorched mark on the floor for years to come. So, now for the rest of the story. Before we continue, I would like to explore some of the strange events, the unexplained events surrounding the mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle. I must admit I am skeptic. I have always viewed the stories of the Bermuda Triangle with curiosity, but with a mixture of a belief that it was mainly myth or legend that just happened to coincide with a few strange events. So let's look at these so-called strange events that no one has come up with a reasonable explanation for, and you make your own judgment, because there's quite a lot in the story that relates back to this strange, very special area of the ocean.
On the 5th of December 1945, 14 Navy airmen left Florida and took to the skies on what was supposed to be a routine training exercise known as Flight 19. But 1 hour and 45 minutes into their journey, the flight's leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, radioed the control tower alerting them that something was dreadfully wrong. Taylor reported that all 3 of his compasses had malfunctioned. He said, "We don't know which way is west. Everything is wrong. Even the ocean doesn't look as it should." Flying over the western part of the North Atlantic Ocean in what's now called the Bermuda Triangle, Flight 19 was never seen again. Later that same evening, a search plane was sent in a desperate attempt to locate the missing flight. But just 27 minutes after takeoff, the search plane and its 13-man crew also became lost to the Bermuda Triangle. Surreal activities in the Bermuda Triangle have been reported since 1492, when the crew of explorer Christopher Columbus edged ever closer to what he would call the New World. Columbus's log reported seeing strange lights, whilst the sea took on an eerie calm before rising high without wind. Situated between Florida, Bermuda and Puerto Rico, the name Bermuda Triangle was coined by author Vincent Gaddis in a 1964 article in the magazine Argosy to explain the perceived phenomenon of airplanes and ships going missing without a trace and without explanation. He was compelled by mysteries like Flight 19 and the USS Cyclops, which got lost at sea off the coast of Barbados in 1918, resulting in the loss of 306 lives, the biggest loss of life in US Navy history, not related to combat. Gaddis reported that the Bermuda Triangle is a true mystery and that even the US Navy, the Air Force and the Coast Guard investigators have admitted they are baffled by it. In the last century alone, 1,000 ships and planes have disappeared without a trace within the 500,000 square miles of the Bermuda Triangle. Despite no wreckages to provide evidence, there are endless theories about the disastrous paranormal mechanisms involved in the Bermuda Triangle. This has been suggested in explaining the story of the Ellen Austin, an American vessel that found a deserted schooner on the Atlantic Ocean. In order to capture the schooner for themselves, members of crew from the Ellen Austin agreed to man the ship back to shore, but during the journey the 2 ships separated, and when they reunited, the schooner was once again deserted, the crew having once again vanished without a trace. Author Gian Kazar believes that electromagnetic anomalies in the area's atmosphere have been responsible for historic compass breakdowns. He describes the electronic fog as something that will seize the aircraft and travel with you. You are not flying into the fog, it is flying with you. Whilst some conspiracists look to the skies of the Bermuda Triangle for answers, others believe that the answers lie deep underwater. With the discovery in 1968 of the submerged rock formation known as the Bimini Road, after the island of Bimini, conspiracy theorists Paul Weinsweig and Pauline Zalitsky have come to believe that this formation is man-made and therefore evidence of the underwater city of Atlantis. It has been suggested that the planes and ships that have vanished in this area may have been affected by leftover technology from this empire, such as the ancient crystals thought to have powered the civilization. Or not, the Bermuda Triangle League system in the Caribbean Atlantic can be unpredictable, and the Bermuda Triangle happens to cover the same area as Hurricane Alley, an area of warm water and high humidity which is the source of devastating storms and hurricanes. Also located within the Bermuda Triangle is the Puerto Rico Trench, the deepest part of the Atlantic Ocean, where the seafloor is up to 28,373 feet deep, suggesting any aircraft or ship destroyed in the Bermuda Triangle would sink so far from the surface it would never be reached. Although the US government insists that the Bermuda Triangle doesn't exist, in 1964, the same year the term Bermuda Triangle was coined, the US government began construction of Ortec, an underwater American base within the Bermuda Triangle, off the coast of the Bahamas. This base has further strengthened the suspicion that the area hosts mysterious properties. Since the 1960s, the US have used this base to conduct underwater tests, research and in-air tracking, raising questions about what exactly they are monitoring down there. It symbolizes the reality that, despite all we know of the world, and despite all our advances in tracking devices, our world is still large enough for our ships and our planes to disappear.
You have 2 right-angled triangles together. They have a hypotenuse line which apparently runs directly up to Panama City, but highly technical. Of course, many other Florida towns and cities lay along this line, but the significance was that this was the direct route taken by Ivan when it looped back from Miami. As things turned out, a careless act of mankind in the form of a huge oil spill threatened the Gulf Coast with the prospect of an oily black waterfront. And the condo market tanked, so that was the end of the condo plan for the now derelict land. An entrepreneur seized on the prospect of the bar, which we now know was off the hook. The opportunity arose just like the phoenix, reborn from its own flames, fury and ashes. He visualized a tourist marina and of course the charismatic bar named Off the Hook. And so, this is where our story really begins to take hold. As you can see, it was an outdoor Caribbean style bar with really plenty of character, waterfront, and the thing that appealed to me the most was they had this strict rule that the customer's dog received a bowl of water before the customer got a drink. After a few exploratory trips, I decided to make it my local. I think I should mention that as much as I grew to enjoy the ambience of the place, my two Boston Terriers loved their occasional visits even more. As the popularity of the place increased, so did the population of the dogs who provided the entertainment. But as much fun as they were, I could not help noticing a pattern of strange behaviour from them, especially during dreary days when few people were present. Usually they enjoyed the attention of the customers and other dogs, but now and again you would notice them seem to be distracted by something or someone that intimidated them. They would bark for no reason and become extremely skittish and protective of their owners at certain times for no apparent reason, or for no reason that we were aware of. This all came to a head on a nasty Memorial Day weekend, when the bar had been closed for 2 or 3 days due to inclement weather, bringing unpredictable and frequent rain showers. Finally, the clouds gave way to blue skies, and I decided to drive down to the bar to see if it had reopened. We had lost Nelson's dad recently, and he became my constant companion, primarily because, having attended his dad's funeral, when he would get lonely, he'd try and dig up his deceased parent. So that's why I kind of did not leave him to his own devices. When we got there, and to our dismay, no one was around. The bar stools were propped up against the closed bar. It was an open bar, as you can see from the photos, of course. I made a U-turn in the parking lot and I was ready to head home when suddenly Nelson seemed to have other ideas. He jumped in the front seat and came over to me and pressed his paw against my hand on the steering wheel, as if making it clear that he wanted to at least have a walk around the place anyway. So what I thought, a walk on the dock, checking the aftermath of the dreary weather and the stormy conditions, would have made our trip worthwhile. Nelson stopped dead when we approached the usual place where we entered the bar. I coaxed him to continue farther, down to the dock, but he remained steadfast. And being the disciplined dog owner that I was, I just let him have his way. By now the showers had drizzled away, and a few hopeful rays of sunshine were peeking through the clouds. Nelson pulled me to our usual table on the parking lot side of the bar, and I noticed a group of men at the end table, huddled in intense conversation. I thought at first they were going to a fancy dress party due to the way they were dressed. Some of them seemed to be in period costumes. Nelson planted himself down beside me, threw back his head, and emitted a fiendish howl, the like of which I've never heard before. One of the men looked up and beckoned me. "His name is Nelson, right?" I was certain I'd not met this person before, any of the group either, but I made a point of being polite. "That's right," I said. I'm sorry we disturbed you." "Not at all," he continued. "We were waiting for you." I decided to play along, although I was sure I'd not seen any of these men before. He seemed to read my mind and nodded towards Nelson. "Your dog has seen us, and so have the other dogs. Most of them have owners that could never see us. Every time you visit this place, he knows we are here, even if you cannot see us." He stretched out his hand to Nelson and immediately calmed him down. "Hello, my name is Lucas, and I believe you are Adam. Now you must be wondering how I know so much about you and your dog." This was getting weird, and it occurred to me that our meeting that day might even have been planned. You see, we've been here for nearly 15 years. We arrived when Hamilton's was here, Hamilton's restaurant. That was why we were left here, to see that place destroyed and to explain why. A few years later, and we are still here. We're looking at what's been built in its place. He explained they'd been trapped in another time and place for many years, some over a century. They'd been carried there by the tornado spawned by Hurricane Ivan in 2004, on the way to their final resting place in Virginia, of all places. The journey had been halted by the tornado's path, the deviation of the hurricane's course, and most importantly, by Hamilton's curse. And they've been trapped in this place ever since. Drugs, I thought. Panama City Beach. This was my immediate response. It had to be. I could not believe any part of what I was hearing. Could I? I suppose most people would have walked away at this point, but my curiosity was aroused. Not the first time in life, at my cost. "So you were ghosts, spirits from another time. But if you've been here all along, and I could not see you before, why can I see you now?" A little embarrassed I asked that, because even given the indication that was going along with this story was far out. Lucas held out his hand. "Here, take my hand. It's flesh and bone, just like yours. We are the undead, if you like, just waiting in limbo to complete our passage from this world like every other human being. But you see, our mission, our final mission, was to see the result of Hamilton's curse in this area, and before we could continue our journey, we need to feel we have completed our task here, and when you hear what we have to say, we believe we will be allowed to move on. Another storm is coming, and this will take us to our final destination." I'd had enough of this charade and said, "Sir, you did not answer my question. Why can I see you now? And you say you can predict hurricanes also. Not too difficult to do between June and November in Florida. Lucas seemed impatient and looked me directly in the eye. You recently visited Regla. Yeah, I bought cigars there. Why? Regla de Ocha, better known as the birthplace of Santeria. You must know something of that culture that enslaves us, and now perhaps you also, as you appear to be, able to see us in human form. My recent trip to Cuba had in fact involved a couple of excursions across the Costa Bay to Regla. We had seen the Church of the Virgin Regla, but dismissed it as a kind of a voodoo show for the tourists. Then I remembered the antiquated bar we went in with the huge ceilings and each table dressed as if for someone's wedding. The old couple who ran the place were extremely pleased to see us, almost as if they'd been expecting us. But we had 3 hurricanes, Harvey, Irma and Maria last year. Why did they not release you? Am I really going along with this? I don't. Because we had not met you, said Lucas. The curse cannot be vindicated until those injured know why the gods of Santeria were angry. I am telling you this to complete the final part of our mission, so you will relate to the others why the name Hamilton brought destruction to your door. I shook my head and ready to leave. You don't understand, he continued. The West is obsessed with the Bermuda Triangle, but it's the history of what happened within those waters that caused the mystery. Bermuda was discovered by Sir George Somers, etc. Yes, I said, I know the rest of the story. Explained that I remembered all about George Somers from school, and I just cannot believe that I'm actually going along listening to this story, to be quite honest. Lucas turned to one in the group. That's Johnson's relative. His great-great-grandfather moved the capital, yeah, he was the one, from St. George to Hamilton. Despite Renisi leaving the population who had built their livelihoods there to starve. Families perished, children were eaten by wild animals, and the names Hamilton and Johnson were cursed for eternity. That was over 200 years ago, and you claim to be trapped here because of the name Hamilton's Restaurant? This sounds like one big tall story, and I don't think I'm buying it. Lucas smiled. With a roll of his eyes, he said, look over your shoulder. What I saw lying in the lagoon was truly astonishing. Old steamer lay beached just west of the dock where the rental boats were lined up. That's the hotel for the undead, grinned Lucas. You are the first one, and perhaps the only one, probably in the USA, that can see the SS Cotopaxi today. Lost in 1925, but found again by my friend here, Jeffrey Johnson, 2 years ago. According to your government, it doesn't exist. But listen to Jeffrey's account and see what you think. Jeffrey Johnson smiled, and despite his ragged appearance, he looked every inch the nouveau riche yuppie you would find prowling around in his Porsche, looking for a parking spot near the Bank of England in Threadneedle Street, London. My name is Jeffrey Johnson. For my sins, or rather for the sins of my great-great-grandfather, Commodore George Johnson, the one and the same who switched the capital of Bermuda to Hamilton all those years ago, causing so much poverty and misery for all the people of St. George. George Johnson was eventually shown up for what he was, and this greedy man was kicked out of Bermuda and returned to England in shame. I was the unlucky one, chosen to bear the cross for his sins, but now I believe I've served my penance and atoned somewhat for his greed and avarice. All my life I've been fascinated by the intrigue and the mystery surrounding the lost city of Atlantis. I'd even learned to dive in the icy cold waters of the English Channel so that I would be able to explore some of the possible sites where the ancient city had vanished. The problem was that the so-called experts had placed the lost empire in so many different parts of the world. According to Plato, it disappeared somewhere in the Mediterranean near Morocco. Others favoured Egypt, while the Greek islands had a claim also. I'd spent a lot of time in the Med, and another possibility, the Antarctic, was about as inviting as the bitterly cold winter I had just experienced in Manchester, England. So when I read about the Bimini Road theory in the tropical islands of the Bahamas, it was a no-brainer. In 1938, noted psychic and seer Edgar Cayce predicted that evidence of Atlantis would be discovered in the Bahamas off the island of Bimini in 1968 and 1969. Sure enough, in 68, it's believed that the pilot of a low-flying small plane sighted Bimini Road off the west coast of North Bimini for the first time. Lying in just 18 feet of water, shaped like the letter J and stretching half a mile in length at least, and then disappearing, the road consists of tightly spaced, evenly shaped large blocks. They vary in size and shape from square to rectangular, some as large as 12 feet across. Although it's been eroded and rounded off over the ages, the edges of the stones are nearly straight, a condition very unusual if nature was responsible. There was an ongoing controversy about this submerged layer of stones, with the wannabe believers like me insisting that their perfectly symmetrical form proved that they had been hewn from concrete blocks by humans as part of a wall or pathway in ancient times. Of course, others had said impossible, and every geological scientist and paranormal on the planet had thrown their hat in the ring on this subject. There was certainly evidence that another underwater city had been discovered near Pino del Rio in Cuba, and many considered the Bimini Road to be a connecting highway between the two cities.
In 2001, marine engineer Pauline Zalitsky and her husband Paul Weinzweig claimed to have discovered an ancient city buried 650 meters deep in the ocean. Spread over 200 meters, the breathtaking underwater find off the west coast of Cuba includes sphinxes and 4 pyramids, all made out of smooth, precisely hewn stone. The site is within the Bermuda Triangle, but this is not the only startling thing about the discovery. Zalitsky and Weinzweig believe these are the ruins of the lost city of Atlantis. The Triangle is a 1.3 million square kilometer stretch of ocean between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. It was brought to public attention in 1964, when journalist Vincent Gaddis described it as deadly. He asked readers of Argosy magazine, "What is there about this particular slice of the world that has destroyed hundreds of ships and planes without a trace?" Pauline Zalitsky and Paul Weinzweig believe they may finally have solved the mystery by finding the ancient island city-state of Atlantis. All that is known about the lost civilization comes from the writings of Greek philosopher Plato in the 4th century BC. Plato discussed Atlantis in two of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. He describes it as a ruthless, morally bankrupt and warmongering civilization, with its sights set on world domination. But the gods decided to punish the Atlanteans for their desperate greed and hunger for power. The empire was washed away by violent tidal waves over the course of just a few hours. Amazingly, the structures in the Bermuda Triangle appear to be just the remnants of a much larger, sophisticated metropolis. Zalitsky notes, "It's a really wonderful structure which really looks like it could have been a large urban center. However, it would be totally irresponsible to say what it was before we have evidence."
And so I rented a boat from Bill Keefe, long-time owner of Bimini Undersea Adventures, and asked him what he thought of the road's origin. "Honestly, I don't know," he said. "One part of me wants to believe it's a piece of Atlantis, but my more practical side wants to think it's just beach rock. I really don't know." We drop over the side and the bubbles clear. I get my first look at the road, an extraordinary path of paving stones, stretching seemingly endlessly in both directions. I've heard stories about the road, but they all seem like tall tales. Atlantis, here up Bimini. I spend more than an hour on the site and realise that the only problem with this theory is the path's slower curve. If the beach rock concept were true, Bimini Road would in theory follow the straight line of the shore. While not fully investigated or verified, there are reports of lower layers of supporting stones. To true Atlantean theorists, it appears to be much more like a breakwater, a dock or a harbour. So with less than 1/4 of a tank left, I swam round to take one last look at the stones. When suddenly the whole seabed began to shake and vibrate. Slowly at first, then mixed with a few fierce convulsions which seemed to be coming from a small crater a few yards from where I was swimming. It was an extraordinary sight. It almost literally took my last remaining breath away. What had been an empty desert suddenly turned into a erupting seabed. It was really hard for me to take it in. I felt almost as if I had landed on another planet. I didn't know how long the eruption was going to last. Bubbles the size of basketballs were cascading upwards, erupting from the ocean floor, followed by a trail of sediment. In the murky distance, just beside where the crater had now doubled in size, something suddenly rose up from the seabed. I peered through the gloom, but all visibility was then lost in the dense fog of sediment and floating debris. Gradually I began to make out the hull of a ship. Clouds of sand explode from the hull as an hailstorm of bubbles stream upwards as the rusting relic begins to slowly climb back to the world it left years ago, as it appears. Even the basketball-sized bubbles were now dwarfed by a group that had joined together to create massive air pockets, some of which were engulfing significant parts of the hull and side of the ship as she continued her eerie ascent. I'd studied oceanology enough to know that these were methane gas bubbles erupting from the ocean floor, yet I had never realized that they could be so big as to propel objects with such force. I can see the ship more clearly now. Parts of the rusted deck rails were dropping away into a mass of tangled metal, causing mass exodus of marine life fleeing from the structure of the ship. I watch awestruck as a giant ray glides by, then is sucked backwards towards the rising ship. I looked back, seeing more rocks slide away from the crater edge, thrusting sediment in and around us in large clouds. Peering into the ever-deepening crater, I thought I saw the dim outline of what looked like parts of an ancient city, but I had no time for sightseeing. I realize I am in danger as my air has almost gone. But as a novice diver, I was afraid to ascend too quickly to the surface, even from the depth of only 20 feet. But given my time down there for over 30 minutes, in the event I had no decision to make, a giant rumbling sound, a little softened by the depth of the water, but still deafening, dragged me towards the ship in kind of a tornado or a water spout type spiraling pull. Grasping onto what was left of the deck rail, the ship, and me, its unwilling stowaway, popped up like a cork. The sea was calm, and the ship bobbed gently under lingering bubbles of methane gas, and the sun began to sink slowly over the Bahamas. In the distance, I could see the rental skiff awaiting my return, and having seen and experienced more than enough for one day, I wondered if I had one last gasp of energy to swim the 200 yards or so between the ship, or whatever it was I was on the skiff. My swimsuit was torn to shreds, both legs and arms were bleeding, but in a way the pain was reassuring, as it proved I was still in the land of the living and had not been spirited away into another dimension. That was about to change also. As the sun dropped below the horizon, a few flashes from the wheelhouse, followed by a moment of snapping and crackling. The ship lit up from stem to stern, every single lamp, searchlight, cabin light penetrating the dusk around us. Bloody impossible, I yelled aloud. I looked around thinking I was hearing my own voice resonating through the ghostly corridors of the ship, but no, it was another human voice. Ahoy there! In the distance, a small powerboat was circling the skiff and calling us with a hailer. I'm looking for a diver, an English guy on vacation here. I thought to climb up to the bridge and wave, but some unseen force was holding me on deck, and I had no option but to remain where I was. As if sensing an intruder, the ship suddenly found power and immediately turned to take a course westward. Picking up speed, the old tug showed no signs of sluggish performance, at least not for a tramp steamer. Oh, that's what I thought it was. A tramp was certainly how I felt at that moment in time, struggling as I was to come to terms with recent events. I was always attracted to the unusual, but generally found ghost stories and other tales of the paranormal to be a bit on the lame side. Obviously, the reason I'd come to the Bahamas was to explore the legend of Atlantis, which is as paranormal as you can get. But nevertheless, I reasoned that the ship was somehow piloted by remote control. The rental company were probably involved in the raising of the ship, some kind of stunt to promote tourism. In other words, I remained a total skeptic, even though I'd been forced onto this rust bucket, shackled with some kind of hypnotic restraint that stopped me moving freely around the ship, never mind jumping overboard and swimming to freedom. I'd no idea how long I slept, or if it was part of the transition into this limbo state I'm in now between life and death. I assure you I was more of a cynic about all of this than you, but the power of Santeria is irrefutable and controlled all my movements. Anyway, I woke up in the Bay of Havana, Cuba, not Guantanamo Bay as reported worldwide. I was boarded by the Cuban Ghost Guard, who's rummaged around the ship for hours, constantly ignoring my offers to help with an explanation of how we got there. That's when I realized I was invisible to those people. And although I might have crossed over into another dimension, the boat was still the SS Cotopaxi and very much a part of their real world. The following day we were surrounded by a fleet of United States Coast Guard boats who boarded under the supervision of the Cuban officials. I learned a lot about the old tug that had captured me by listening to their conversations or those of their interpreters. It seems my ship had disappeared en route to Havana in 1925, and the captain's logbook and other artifacts confirmed the identity of the ship. The conversations turned heated as another group of US officials arrived and demanded that the boat be scuppered, as an incident such as this would cause embarrassment to both nations.
The mysterious Bermuda Triangle, where anything can happen, and now a cargo ship reappears 90 years after going missing. Could you believe that? The Cuban Coast Guards has said that they'd captured a ghost ship heading for the island, which is acknowledged to be the SS Cotopaxi. It was gone missing 90 years from today in December 1925 and has since been associated to the tales of the mysterious Bermuda Triangle. WHOIT happened? The Cuban Coast Guards noticed the ship on May 16, last year near a restrained Navy zone, west of Havana. They made many ineffective attempts to keep in touch with the ship and its crew, and in the end, when no answer was received, they mobilized 3 patrol boats to capture the ghost ship. What was on the ship? When the patrol boats encircled the ship and launched a search operation on it, they were shocked to see that the ship was certainly a nearly 100-year-old historical steamer acknowledged as the SS Cotopaxi, a label notably connected to the tales of the Bermuda Triangle. There are no humans on board, no captain, no crew, nothing, and it was noticed that the ship was not controlled or used by anybody since ages. But it was quite sure that the steamer was a tramp freighter gone missing in 1925. What has been found on the ship? The ship was all abandoned since ages, and after an extensive research, they finally managed to find the captain's logbook. Certainly, related to the Clinch Field Navigation Company, but the owners of the ship has not filed any claims or event hasn't introduced any clue regarding what occurred to the ship over the last 90 years. What happened to Cotopaxi in 1925? It was the 29th day of November in 1925, when the SS Cotopaxi left the Charleston port in South Carolina, and directed toward Havana, Cuba. There were 32 crew members on board and were under the command of Captain W. J. Meyer, and used to be carrying a cargo to Caribbean. It was 2,340 tons of coal. The ship was once deferred to missing 2 days later, and was missing for close to 90 years, and nobody even talked about the ship in past 90 years that it was found or something. The mysterious reappearance of the SS Cotopaxi has, nevertheless, already created a lot of attention in the scientific area and would push some experts to change their intellect on the field.
Unfortunately for the authorities, the press had got wind of this, as you just saw, and it appeared on news channels and news feeds across the globe. But nevertheless, they agreed that the ship was to be towed out to their chosen grounds for extinction and shelled until it sank to the bottom of the sea. They fastened our position with a huge anchor, and as you can imagine, we thought the game was up. We were going to be sunk into our watery grave, and that would be the end of that. But our position for that night was midway between the city of Havana and the rural towns of Casablanca and Regla. Around midnight that night, a flotilla of small boats encircled us, carrying burning torches with gaily dressed people dancing and singing to a constant drumbeat on their tiny crafts. They did not come aboard us, but it was obvious that they were staging some kind of ritualized festival or cultural celebration in our honor. The ritual, I now understand, was called a tam ball, I understand, was actually conducted by the Aknor, or High Priest, and it ended as suddenly as it had begun. But whatever protection it had conveyed to the US Cotopaxi, we found ourselves not shelled and scuppered somewhere in the Atlantic, but breached on the shores of St. Andrews Bay in North Lagoon, Florida, the following morning. When questioned by the world press, Petty Officer 3rd Class Eric Woodall of the US Coast Guard office in Miami told the Associated Press his agency had received no reports of the Cotopaxi being recovered. The Coast Guard said Thursday that the statement stands. The government denial was to be expected given their long-standing refusal to acknowledge US old sightings, etc. But here was an entire ship that they had found, searched and secured, then lost, all in the space of 2 days. And there was the evidence right outside the bar in the lagoon, but only I could see it. The next gentleman to speak to Lucas's right was a tall, swarthy gentleman of apparently Latin descent. He was dressed very much as if he'd just come out of a disco in the late 70s or the 80s with the pointed collar and the tight trousers, but probably not more than 25-30 years old. So as he began, I was obviously looking for some explanation as to what I just heard, but his story, I suppose, is even more fantastic, but well documented, and there have been many similar experiences. He began. My name is Alonzo, and I had flown to Miami with my friend Sergio in his small twin-engined aircraft. He had opened a small restaurant in Havana, and I was helping him purchase some equipment at a commercial auction. About 15 minutes into our flight back to Cuba, a hazy mist enveloped us, and we noticed a strange-looking cloud ahead. As with most things in Cuba, the fuel gauge did not work, and my door latch was worn, so I braced myself as the door had to be held firmly shut during the expected turbulence. The plan functioned normally at first, but we immediately had the feeling of gradual rotation as we entered the cloud. It seemed like we were flying through a tunnel that appeared to be narrowing the further we continued.
Bruce Gernon claimed they were thrown off course by an electronic fog. This appears as a thick black cloud that forms a tunnel around a plane or a ship, disorienting the people on board and hurtling the vessel forwards faster than the speed of light. Bruce Gernon says that whilst trapped in the fog, all of the navigational and electronic devices on board ceased to work. Importantly, his story is not unique and defies scientific explanation.
We started to have a feeling of negative gravity, and the few instruments that we did have stopped working. After 90 minutes or so, we were still in the cloud, and thick concentric circles engulfed us. Sergio said we should be over Havana, but the lower we flew, the thicker the lines became, almost like flying through a glass vase or cylinder. On the 2-hour mark, Sergio knew we were about to run out of fuel and began to descend. The cloud followed us, with still no sign of land or blue water below. Eventually, we lost all notion of gravity. Books, pencils and maps began to fly around the cabin. The door flung open, and the last thing I remember was the urge to step out of the plane and sit on the wing. We had lost all sense of motion. It was a terrible, terrible experience, he said. As we emerge from the cloud, it is blue water below, and I rub my eyes in horror as I realize I am sat next to a skeleton. Plane engine stutter, then cut out. We are out of gas and headed for the sea in a nosedive. Vaguely I remember seeing the huge statue of Christ overlooking the El Morro fort in Havana Bay, hurtling towards us. I brace for the splash and we float for a moment, but the door is now forced open on its hinges and seawater pours in. No one spoke for a moment. We were all in a state of shock until Lucas looked up and said, "Not an unusual story. Many ships and planes have experienced that same phenomenon of entering a time warp or a wormhole in space, as it is called. Most of these go unreported, but here is one that got a lot of coverage," said Lucas, and pushed an old crinkled newspaper across the table to me. Finally, it was the turn of the young man that I thought had been in fancy dress. I realized that, of course, these were the clothes when his change of existence took place. "Just call me Frankie," he said. I was a bare-knuckle fighter in Manchester, England, and did all right too. 5 bob for a win, and half a crown if I lasted over 3 rounds. Then got caught pilfering an apple from Ardwick Market and sentenced to deportation to Beggars Colony, Australia. A lot of it went on then, orphans and criminals, or so-called criminals. I escaped the same day over the prison yard wall and walked Bridgewater Canal towpath to Liverpool. Adopted a couple of dogs along the way, survivors like me. Ratlad was my meal ticket, a Manchester Terrier bred to flush out the tiniest burrows and rat holes, and always returning with a plump squirrel. A rabbit. Along our way to Liverpool, he expanded our menu to include stoats, weasels, and the occasional otter. Benny, the other dog, was a purebred English bulldog, lazy, fat and useless, or so I thought at the time. Many a frosty night when we scratched out a meal beside the canal, I questioned whether he was worth his share. We got to Liverpool docks in about 10 days. There were river marshals riding the canal narrow boats, so I had to be careful, and spent a good deal of time hiding in the bushes along the towpath. Signed on for a West Indies trader and got a real liking for the warm weather in Jamaica and the Caribbean. Amazing thing was, Ratlad was waiting for me dockside whenever we got back to Liverpool. Benny got fatter and lazier on board and became the cook's favourite. Fit as a butcher's dog, they said. But Ratlad could not handle life on the ocean waves. He tried to eat the ship's cat the day we signed on, and barked and growled at everybody. All that was before we left port. So we had to part company and leave him to his own resources. Believe me, he had plenty. Third time out, a storm forced us into Plymouth Harbour, 300 miles south. We never did get to Liverpool that trip. And that was the last I saw of Ratlad. Benny just loved the time when it came to set sail again, and we jumped at the chance for a full berth on a French ship that had been in dry dock for a refit. This gave Benny and me a full bunk, which was a lot better than the hammock that he would often roll out of. Problem was, everyone, including the captain, spoke only French. So as useful as I was to them in Plymouth, I became "Salé comme anglais" when we left port. I'll leave the interpretation to your imagination. To be honest, I did not care where we were going, nor had the faintest idea where Cuba was, but I had heard they loved boxing and looked forward to earning a few peso on the wharfs and side streets of Old Havana. It was a fast ship, and we crossed the Atlantic in mainly fine weather. So Benny and I were sunning ourselves, enjoying life when we reached warmer climes. He had learned a few words of French from the rest of the crew, and he soon became everybody's favourite, but generally he followed me wherever he could. That is when he wasn't sprawled out sleeping, passing wind, or eating tidbits from the gallery. We were about 3 days off Havana when the winds dropped and our progress stalled. To make matters worse, we were becalmed in a huge mass of seaweed that formed a thick brown carpet around us as far as the eye could see.
Sea called the Sargasso Sea. It gets its name because of this common brown seaweed that can be found floating in vast mats. The area of the Sargasso Sea is about 700 miles wide and 2,000 miles long. Now the seaweed itself is fascinating stuff. It was first observed and called Gulf weed by Christopher Columbus. It gets the name sargum from the Portuguese. Some people use it as herbal remedies. But out in the middle of the Sargasso Sea, the water is some of the bluest in the world. It's there you can see 200 feet deep in places. It also has a great biodiversity and ecosystem that surrounds the Sargasso Sea. For years, scientists wondered where the American and the Atlantic eels were breeding. They knew the adult eels swam down the rivers out into the Atlantic, but they never could find the place where they reproduced. Finally, they discovered it was out in the middle of the Sargasso Sea. So it's a fascinating place, but if you were an ancient sailor, you did not want to get stuck there. Being caught in the doldrums was extremely difficult for the ancient sailors. Of course, their boats were driven by wind and sail, and they'd be caught in the vast mats of the seaweed that would wrap around their rudder. Barnacles would begin to grow. It's an area that is notorious for light and baffling winds, and so they'd make no progress. They'd get stuck. The men would become extremely dispirited. Sometimes violence and even insanity would break out as people were trapped in the doldrums.
I remembered an image of this place on a packet of Will's Woodbines. People would buy 2 or 3 cigarettes back in the day when that's all it could afford, or un packet de cigarettes, as I explained to my crewmates. We were told it was common in these waters to be held up in the Sargasso Sea, as it was called, but after a week of languishing in the blinding hot sun, with food and water now on ration, both the crew and the captain were getting anxious. The captain himself was an old man, and this was to have been his last cruise. But as the 3rd week arrived and still no wind, he succumbed to the intense heat and poor conditions. Some of the crew said he had eaten some of the seaweed, but no one really knew for sure. First mate was not a good leader, and everyone was irritable and impatient. So, all in all, it brought out the worst in us. After the 3rd week in this stationary, steaming cauldron, we had to let the horses and the livestock go. The stench was adding more misery, and the water had almost gone. Previous sailors becalmed there had actually named it the horse latitudes for the same reason. We noted that all the livestock and horses swam to the east, and most of us reasoned that they were following the scent of land. After 1 month, our options were becoming very limited. In broken French, I was given a choice: stay there and die, or launch the boats with the rest of the crew and follow the horses. The first mate was dead set against us. He knew the prospect of our return was debatable, and even if we did, would the ship be still waiting for us? Who knows? There didn't seem much of a choice, and we could not see any real danger in doing this. We had not seen any sharks or whales swimming around, and we knew there were many eels lurking in the seaweed, but they held no danger for me. In fact, after a good fight in Manchester, I often parted with my winnings at the nearest pub, drinking beer and eating jellied eels. So it was on the morning of the 40th day. About 20 of the crew members and our talisman Benny piled into the 3 rowboats and pulled away to find food, water and hopefully land. The first mate and a couple of his cronies stayed behind, happy that the remaining food we had left them and the half barrel of water would last much longer now. Just between the 3 of them. Towards the end of the first day we were tired and a little disappointed that we had not seen any sign of land, when suddenly the lead boatswain began to yell excitedly and point to the horizon. With renewed energy we pulled the boats through the brown slime, but what we saw brought horror and despair to everyone in the boats. The bloated carcass of one of our horses was writhing under tangled masses of huge moray eels. The horse was long dead, but continuously twitching from the electric shocks delivered by these monsters. The ship's company fell into silence. Even Benny seemed to grasp the full import of this macabre sight and recorded his verdict with a slow, nervous growl. We could only imagine the fate of the other poor animals, but the disgusting lithograph of a horse being attacked by eels with the devil watching came back to me from my schoolboy history lessons. Not one word was spoken, at least not in English. We rowed a discreet distance from the carnage and circled the 3 boats together into a triangle to offer mutual protection, or so we thought. I awoke with a start to see a gruesome sight of my feet covered in a mass of giant eels, 3 to 4 feet long, all decapitated, with Benny occasionally picking them up and tossing them around to make sure they were no longer a threat to his master. The remaining 5 men in my boat were all dead, and the other 2 boats were more like funeral pyres awaiting flame. Each and every corpse covered in moray eels nibbling on the heads of the victims. I took up the oars and rowed back in the direction from which we came. I was probably in shock and just going through the motions for most of the 2 days it took me to find the ship. The scene that I had just left was so bizarre that a part of me relished telling the first mate that he'd been right all along. I climbed up the rope ladder, still dangling from when we had left, to find the ship's deck a seething mass of eels of all descriptions. My God, I exclaimed, and returned to the rowboat quickly, afraid Benny, my defender, would get the call to action. This time he would have no chance, as there were thousands of them. We were obviously right in the middle of their breeding ground. I stopped on the lowest rung of the ladder and saw I was too late. The boat was overflowing with the hideous creatures. Poor Benny had fought valiantly to the end. In a blind rage, I ploughed into those wretched serpents, wielding the boat oars, one in each hand like a madman. I cleared enough space to find my beautiful, loyal Benny, breathing his last in the bottom of the boat, punctured along his entire body with the venomous teeth marks of his assailants. I cradled his broad head in my arms and received his last whimper of goodbye, then that glorious look of trust as he closed his eyes as if to tell me, thank you for loving him. I was a better human being for having known that fat, lazy dog who had saved my life and gave his own, protecting me. My melancholy was disturbed as huge veins of lightning shot from the leaden clouds. Gradually the wind picked up and the seaweed parted, forming a pathway in front of the ship. I climbed aboard and held back the tears as my wonderful Benny floated away, now the captain of his own ship. I found the first mate and his cohorts partly devoured in the gallery and cast overboard, muttering a few words of Christian reverence. As I spoke, the lightning struck again, this time hitting the ship, knocking it off starboard and turning every piece of metal into a white-hot beacon as we sailed into the night. And that, my skeptical friend Adam, is the last thing I remember before arriving in this strange world and meeting my new crew, although they tell me I haven't been around for the last 200 years. Oh, by the way, I did not tell you my name. It's Frankie Johnson. Nice to meet you. The clunking of the car doors heralded the arrival of the bar staff at Off the Hook, no doubt summoned to work as the weather had improved. Slowly the images of the men became blurry as their chatter trailed off, and within seconds they had disappeared. Nelson was visibly disturbed and frantically began searching under every table and bar stool for them. Pulling on his leash, he dragged me to the end of the bar and sat visibly shaking and barking towards the place where I had seen the old steamer earlier. Now there was nothing but a few afternoon fishing boats cruising by from the pass. Lucas's last word to me that day, a day I shall always remember, was simply this: "Thank you, Adam, for helping us. You and your dog. You dared to believe." "Hey, Adam," said Brandy, "you must have been thirsty. Rolling Rock?" Okay, please," I answered, although the beer was the last thing on my mind. "I'd better get the hours in while I can," said Brandy. "Another storm is coming this way," she continued. Her words jolted me back to reality. Oh, if this really was reality, where on earth had I been? Sure enough, a storm had reached tropical status around Cuba, and Hurricane Amanda was preparing to enter the box, as the insurance pundits call that area south of Miami. Within a couple of days, Amanda had come and gone. All fur coat and no knickers, as Frankie Johnson would have said. It took a swipe at the cove as it barreled through the pass and caused a bit of flooding in St. Andrews. By all accounts, it never became more than a force 1, or a low 2 at the most, although it was seen to hang around the Thomas Drive area for longer than expected. About 3 a.m. that morning, I woke up with a start to hear Nelson howling in the strangest way. He was sat in the middle of the floor, head tilted back and staring into thin air, yet his body was twitching as if responding to some unseen stimulus. The news at 10, later that day, reported 4 strangely dressed men found floating face down in the South Lagoon earlier that morning, and close by, the hull of a partly submerged steamer near the bridge, abandoned, derelict, and a complete mystery as to how it got there.